Beautiful. All right. So, yeah, welcome to Lecture 9, Natural Deduction. So, really, genuinely, I love all the stuff that we cover in this class, but this is when it gets to be the stuff that I most look forward to every year. Because natural deduction is super fun. It's really interesting. It's kind of building on everything that we've done already. And it's a totally different way to approach all of the kind of logical ideas that we've been practicing and thinking about. So my plan, what I'd like to do, I want to start off by taking about, let's call it 10 minutes or so, probably a little bit longer, but 10-ish minutes, to give you an idea of what natural deduction is and kind of the motivation for being interested in this natural deduction system. And then we're going to spend the bulk of today going through the rules that constitute the system. And I've got to say right off the jump that I've thought about how to do this, and I've done it a lot now, many years. And just from experience and kind of things, the way I found to teach it most effectively is to give you all the rules kind of in one big go. And it can be very, we'll call it confusing or daunting, because there's a good number of things here. It's a bit like learning the moves to a very complex board game. And again, the best way I've found to do it is I give you all the moves, all the rules, and then we kind of work with them together to understand how they function. So that's what we're going to do mostly today. And if we get time, we'll talk about the derived rules. If we don't, it's not the end of the world. They're just kind of bolt-on additions. They make our lives a little easier. So we'll spend most of today just talking about the rules and how they work. But first, what natural deduction is, the kind of general idea. So we're talking about TFL today. And when we're faced with TFL argument, we have a wonderful brute force sledgehammer of a tool. Truth tables. Truth tables are amazing. They're incredibly powerful. And they let us assess an argument for validity or whether it's invalid. They let us assess a bunch of semantic properties. But truth tables have some limitations. One big limitation, and in fact kind of the biggest problem, if you like, with them, is that they don't deliver anything that you might call insight. So a truth table can show you that an argument's valid, but it can't show you why the premises get you to the conclusion. That is, how is it that you might reason from the truth of the premises to the truth of the conclusion? It just shows you that there's no valuation, right? There's no real explanation of how to get there from here. And the second problem is a kind of more flat-footed one, which is just that sometimes truth tables are impractical. So here's a valid argument, and it would be a fun little truth table. Lots and lots of sheets of paper there. So that already kind of incentivizes us to start thinking about some alternative approaches. But really, there's the practicality point, but there's this one, right? This sort of delivering insight. How is it that you might reason your way from the premises to the conclusion? And of course, this is just with TFL. When we think about first order logic, right? When we think about first order logic, the tool that we had there of interpretations, they didn't even let us do half the stuff we were interested in. You couldn't use interpretations to show that an argument's valid. Right? All we could do was say, build an interpretation to make the premises true and the conclusion false. So what would we do if you actually have an FOL argument that's valid? How would you show it? Well, I haven't given you a tool for that yet. In fact, to reason about kind of FOL validity, we needed to take into mind all possible interpretations. And there's no way to do that. It's an infinite number. So we have this sort of lurking, it'd be really nice if we had a tool that gave us sort of insight into the train of reasoning, but also there are some practical limitations on the tools we've had so far. Either, sometimes to go back a slide, they're impractical, or they're just simply not up to the job. So this is where we get the kind of motivations for what we're going to talk about for the next 4 weeks. Natural deduction represents an idealized model of the patterns of actual reasoning. The aim of a natural deduction system is to show, and one of the big aims, it can do other things too, but one of the big aims is to show that an argument's valid in a way that delivers insight into why. Effectively, with a natural deduction system, what you'll do is we'll start off with some basic inferences. Think of them almost like premises. And then we'll have very specific reasoning steps that we can take. And we'll use these reasoning steps to go from the premises to a conclusion. The thing that you end up with then is basically a map. This is how a good reasoner would go from these premises to derive the conclusion. And in that way, it delivers the kind of insight that our previous tools simply don't. So what are natural deduction systems meant to do? Well, they clarify the sort of form and structure of our logical reasoning, showing you how an ideal reasoner would go from premises to conclusion. They describe and often just display the means of justifying a conclusion. This is how you know the conclusion follows from these premises. They demonstrate and employ good inference rules that we ideally, implicitly use. And something that's really neat is that the natural deduction system that we're going to use never needs to bother with truth and falsity. So the tools we talked about before, when we're thinking about truth tables and interpretations, we were interested in, if you like, when atoms were true or when things were in the extensions of predicates. We were concerned with the truth or falsity of TFL or FOL sentences. With these tools, we don't have to do that. Instead, what we're going to have is pure syntactic manipulation. We're basically always going to be delivering conditionals. If these premises, then this conclusion. But we're never committing to the premises being true. It's a neat little thing. We'll come back to this a couple points. But okay, so that's what a natural deduction system's meant to do. How does it do it? Well, what we do is we construct formal proofs. And a formal proof here is, just to give a slightly fancy definition, it's going to be a sequence of sentences, some of which are marked as assumptions, premises, right? The last line of which is a conclusion, and we're going to have kind of markers to show how to derive the conclusion from the premises. So the natural deduction system is going to be a way for us to build these kind of proofs. The core of a natural deduction system are the rules. Inference rules. And inference rules basically come in two flavors. One flavor are rules that govern the behavior of the connectives. And that's basically all we're going to talk about today, right? Because TFL is basically just built out of the connectives. There's atoms and connectives, and that's it. But when we get to FOL, we're also going to have some special rules that govern quantifiers and identity. But we'll talk about those in 2 weeks' time. And when it comes to these inference rules, as well as kind of tracking the connectives or the quantifiers and identity, they come in two types. The first type we'll call introduction rules. And these specify when we can add a sentence featuring the relevant connective. So we're going to talk about conjunction introduction in just a second. Conjunction introduction lets us add a sentence featuring conjunction as its main operator into our proof. On the flip side, we have very badly named elimination rules. Elimination rules basically tell us when we can derive a sentence using the relevant main operator. If we're really honest, they're probably better named as exploitation rules. Because what they let us do is use a sentence featuring the relevant operator to to get something. But importantly, it doesn't destroy or consume the sentence we've used. That's why elimination isn't really properly the right term. It's using these sentences. So we're going to talk about introduction and elimination rules for every one of the connectives today. The introduction rules will tell us when we can add a sentence featuring the operator. The elimination rules will tell us when we can use a sentence featuring the operator. And unsurprisingly, there's going to be introduction and elimination rules for every single connective. So here's an idea of what a TFL natural deduction proof is going to look like for us. We've first got an argument. And before we even go forward, you can ask, valid, invalid? What do you think? Valid, invalid? What do you think? Yeah? It's valid. It's valid. So let's talk about it, right? Let's talk through it. So we have our two premises, and our first premise is A conjunction B. And we know that conjunctions are only true whenever both conjuncts are true, right? So the truth of our first premise tells us that A is true and that B is true, right? Now our second sentence is a conditional. And there's lots of ways for conditionals to be true. But if the conditional's true and we know that B is true, then what truth value does C have to have? If the conditional's true and we know B is true, well then the consequent C cannot be false. Because if it was false, the conditional itself would be false. So from what we've got, we know C is true. So we know that A is true, given the first premise, and we know that C is true, from the truth of the second premise and the fact that B is true. So we can then conclude C conjunction A must be true. Now, do we see the train of reasoning we went through there? That's basically what our proof is going to show. It's going to encode this reasoning using explicit rules. So here's how we start a natural deduction proof. The first thing we do is we list off all of our assumptions in a vertical order, and we number them. So we've got our two premises here. So we're going to put them in a vertical line. Number 1 for the first one, 2 for the second one. Once we've finished listing them, we'll draw a horizontal line underneath it. We're going to call this our assumption line. The assumption line helps us out. It says, hey, everything above that line, we're taking as kind of given. We're working with this. Loosely, we might say, we're assuming these to be true. That's rough and ready, but we can kind of work with it. We're saying, hey, assume these are true. And everything below the assumption line, what we're going to do is either be something we'll derive or an additional assumption. So again, first step, we list our premises, number them. Once we finished, we draw our horizontal line underneath, get our assumption line. Second thing, we drop a vertical line. This vertical line is literally our proof line. It starts with our first assumption, and it's going to end with our conclusion. The last line on this is going to be C conjunction A. Basically, if you follow the line down, you'll be able to follow the train of reasoning. That's the thought. As the proof grows, we keep extending the line until it hits the conclusion. So as I said, everything below the assumption line is going to be either something derived via an application of some rule or a new assumption. Let's just talk about the first ones first. We'll come back to new assumptions in a second. So, something derived via the application of the rule. Based on what we have, if we look at the assumptions we're working with, what's something we can immediately get at line 3? Well, again, go back to the kind of informal presentation I gave you just a second ago. If we know, or we're assuming in this case, that sentence 1 is true, what do we know must also be true? 1's a conjunction, so the conjuncts must be true. So let's extract the conjuncts. Let's use what we'll call an elimination rule. We'll take the conjunction in 1, break it in half, and get the first conjunct. What we're doing is we're applying a rule, we're deriving a sentence. When we derive a sentence, you tell me what rule you've used and what sentences you've used it on. In this case, we're going to use conjunction elimination on line 1. Again, metaphorically, we've taken that conjunction, broke it in half, and got one of the conjuncts. More generally, when we're doing a proof, we continue the line down, you number each step as you derive it, you cite the relevant rule and cite the relevant lines. Each rule is going to have different citation practices, because what they're doing is basically making it so you can go back and reread how the rules were applied. Make sense? Beautiful, beautiful. So, okay, we've got A. What do we want to do at line 4? What can we get at line 4? Yeah, we'll do the same thing and get B, right? Remember, that's even what we did in the kind of informal. So we do the same thing and get B. Nice. Nice. So now, we've gotten both halves. Note, we just applied the same rule to the same sentence, the 1. Again, it's not like 1 gets used up. It's there for us to exploit as many times as we want. And now, what we have, look at what we can do at line 5. Remember again, the informal presentation. I said, okay, look, if we know that a conditional is true, which is what line 2 tells us, and we know the antecedent, which is what 4 gives us, what can we then derive at line 5? Well, we must be able to get the consequent. Because if a conditional is true and the antecedent's true, then the consequent must also be true. So we can do this. We'll use what we'll call conditional elimination. And conditional elimination is our first rule that uses 2 lines. In this case, it uses the conditional and the antecedent, and it delivers us the consequent. Okay. And now we're basically set. Line 6 is going to be our conclusion. So how are we going to get line 6? Well, again, our conclusion here is this conjunction. So we can take what we have at line 5, which we've derived. We've said, hey, this must be true given the assumptions we have. And at line 3, which again, this must be true given the assumptions we have. And we can stick them together. Stick them together using a conjunction. Because we've shown that, hey, C must be true and A must be true. So we can introduce a conjunction. Again, the idea here, introduction rules give us a sentence featuring the relevant operator. Elimination rules use, exploit a sentence featuring an operator. And in every case, what we're doing, you say what rule we use and what sentences we applied the rule to, where it came from. And this right here is our first natural deduction proof. It shows that if the 2 premises are true, then you can get to this conclusion, and it shows you how to do it, step by meticulous baby step. So natural deduction proofs, that's what they do. This is just a sample kind of one to get us going. It's not the deepest, most amazing one in the world, but it's a nice kind of instance just to see how it works. So again, the general practice here, we write our premises down, push the assumption line across, and then we just keep going down using our rules until we get ourselves to our conclusion. Yeah. Yeah. So, importantly, what we did to get 5, right, was again the thought that, hey, given line 2, we know the conditional is true. And given line 4, we know the antecedent to the conditional is true. And since we know that a conditional, right, with a true antecedent that is true must have a true consequent, we can then derive C, what we have at line 5. Then the next step to get to 6, because we've derived this sentence and also derived this sentence, we can derive their conjunction. We already have this part and we have that part, so all we got to do is just stick them together. And that's what we do when we introduce the conjunction. Now again, this is a sample. What we're going to do next is talk through all the rules. Because of course, the big trick here is knowing what rules you can do. But if you get the basic idea, the rest is just going to be memorization in some sense. Also want to stress, you don't have to internalize the rules. You don't have to memorize them. I will give you a sheet with all the rules on the final exam. But importantly, if you know them, or at least know how they work, it's going to be a whole lot better of a time. It's not going to work very well if you're flipping back to the sheet and being like, I don't know what the hell any of these are. So you don't have to memorize them, but it's not really going to work if you don't at least have a grip on them. Okay, so let's talk about the rules. We've already covered the first 3 I want to go through, but looking at them will give us a grip on how I'm going to present all of these. Okay? So let's start with our first one, conjunction introduction. So a thing to note before we even talk about the rule is the way I'm going to present these. I've got them with just kind of variables for the number lines here. Right? So M, N, and O just represent any kind of number premise, any kind of position on the line. We'll also note that I haven't drawn in any assumption lines here. Things basically above that last line, they could both be above the assumption line. They could both be below the assumption line. One could be above, one could be below. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we'll be able to have the stuff that's on the line. So it's schematic. Note also that A and B here are in my sexy swash font. So A and B could be simple, they could be atoms, or they could be really, really complex sentences on their own. Doesn't matter. Matters is that if you have a sentence and you got another sentence, then you can form their conjunction. So, conjunction introduction literally tells us if you have 2 sentences on your proof line, cool, then you can introduce a conjunction with those 2. Interesting thing to note, again, we cite the rule, conjunction introduction, and when we use conjunction introduction, cite them in the order that you build them. So in this case, it's M, N, but we could also do it the other way around. And those are technically different sentences syntactically. Of course, it's very easy to play swapsies, and in fact, I think one of the earliest proofs we're going to do is basically showing that conjunction is symmetric, but technically, if we're being pedantic, we need to cite the rules in the right order. So, that's our first rule. Conjunction introduction. If you have 2 sentences on your proof line, you can stick a conjunction in between them, derive their conjunction. So that's conjunction introduction. Our second rule is conjunction elimination. Conjunction elimination says if you have a conjunction, you can break it and get one of the conjuncts. Note, if you wanted to get both conjuncts, you got to use the rule twice. Just like we did with the practice proof a few minutes ago, right? We wanted A and B, so we had to use conjunction elimination twice. And again, the thing to note here, elimination rules are in some sense badly named. They don't kind of destroy the conjunction. It's still there. It's still on your proof line. It's just exploiting it. It's using it. Importantly, though, it only works if the sentence you're eliminating has a conjunction as its main operator. Elimination rules only work on sentences with that relevant connective's main operator. So you can't use conjunction elimination on a sentence that doesn't have a conjunction as its MLO. Okay, so far so good. Feel okay? Okay. All right. Our third rule. Oh, no, I forgot. There's this one. A very silly little example. This is a very quick natural deduction proof. It would have been a really hideous truth table, but it's very easy to see that the argument's in fact valid. Just kind of package it. You can see this conjunct as P and this conjunct as Q. And it's saying, hey, P conjunction Q is the same as Q conjunction P. Again, just don't be caught up in how many different parts there are. See the packages, and we can go. Again, it's just a handy kind of jokey bit about how even these very simple introduction, elimination of conjunction rules give us something pretty powerful. So, okay, our third rule, conditional elimination. Conditional elimination is basically an instance of modus ponens, which I suspect Michael's talked to you about in one of the other classes. Right? The idea is that if you have a conditional and the antecedent of a conditional anywhere in your proof line, then you can derive the consequent. Note there can be as many lines as you want in between. One or both of them could be above your assumption line. One or both of them could be below your assumption line. It doesn't matter. If you have the conditional and the antecedent, you can derive the consequent. One thing to note about our citations here is that when we use elimination rules, a conditional elimination rule, you cite the conditional and then the antecedent. I'm not going to be super picky about it, but it's good and good happens. Okay. Before we move on, questions for me so far? Feeling okay? Good. We can do this, we're doing all right. Thing to note too, right? Our conditional and the antecedent could appear in whatever order you want. But importantly, when we do the citations, again, cite the conditional first and then the antecedent. And you only ever get the consequent. Okay. So now, a little interlude. The interlude involves what we'll call subproofs. Now remember, right off the jump, I said something about how everything below the assumption line is either going to be a sentence derived using a rule or a new assumption. Well, what the hell was I talking about with a new assumption? The idea is that when you're doing a proof, you can, if you like, open a proof inside the proof. So the thought is, all right, we've got our opening assumptions, and then we'd say, cool. If this other thing was also true, then we're going to get some more. So here's an example. Take this argument. Valid, invalid. It's valid. It's valid. So here's the neat thing, right? Let's just look at B. What happens if the premises are true, right? A is true. And if B is true, is the conclusion true? And if B is false, is the conclusion true? So no matter what, conclusion is going to turn out as long as A is true. So let's prove it. Let's prove it. We'll start just like we did before. We list all of our assumptions, draw our assumption line, drop our proof line down. Now, how would we show it? Well, in this case, we can do something very close to what I just said informally. Let's say, okay, given A, if B was also true, then blah, 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 blah. So we're going to say, if B was also true, that is, we open a subproof. This subproof we indicate by marking a line, one line over. We start it with whatever sentence we want our subproof to begin with. And it's kind of taking on as an additional claim, an additional assumption. And we're going to continue our proof, and we're going to do that by continuing both lines downwards. But importantly, as we fill in, every sentence that's on this subproof line, we just keep it in the subproof, because it's contingent on the additional assumption's truth. You can basically see the subproof as being, what could we show if we also had this? If this too. So, with that in mind, what can we do at line 3? What could we derive at line 3 based on what we have here? And remember, whatever we derive is going to be on the inside, right? It's in the subproof, and it can use anything on the subproof line and anything on the main proof line. So what sentence could we get right here? Let's think. We could get A conjunction B. Right? Why can we get A conjunction B? Because again, we can use anything that's on the subproof line, which ain't much, but it's still something. And we can also get anything on the main proof line, which again, ain't much, but it's still something. Effectively, if B were also true, then A conjunction B would be true. I'll say that again. If B was true, then A conjunction B was true. Hey, that sounds kind of cool. That sounds an awful lot like one of our connectives. If B were true, then da-da-da-da-da. By constructing this subproof, what we've shown is that if additional assumption, then this will follow. So we can now do something very nice. We can close the subproof. We close the subproof and we say, okay, I'm now going to renounce my commitment to B. I don't believe it's true. It did its job for me. And when we renounce the subproof, we close it. We move back one line to the left. So it's a little Beyonce, to the left, right? At this point, the subproof is closed. What does that mean? It means that individual lines within the subproof are now verboten. Because every individual line in here was contingent on that additional assumption. But we can still cite the whole subproof, because the whole subproof shows us that if B is true, then A conjunction B would be true. So we can perform this conditional introduction. Introduce a sentence featuring the conditional. In so doing, we discharge the additional assumption. We're no longer committed to it. And we get something from the subproof. Now it's worth stressing, only some rules let us Beyonce. Only some rules let us move a line to the left. Not every rule lets us get something from the subproof back left. Conditional introduction? Sure. Conditional elimination? No. Conjunction introduction elimination? No. Those just kept us on the same line. This is very powerful, this sort of ability to drag you one line to the left, because it means you can go from subproofs back to the main proof. Now again, to stress, right? We can cite the whole subproof, as we do in line 4. What we cannot do is cite any individual line. The individual lines that are in the subproof are gone. There's no going back to them because they rely upon content that when we close the subproof, we don't take on anymore. In this case, the additional assumption we started with. Okay. So, that's the very broad tools. Basically, everything that we're going to do now is working with these kinds of ideas. They're either going to be rules that keep us on the line that we're on, or there'll be lines that require going through a subproof, rules that require going through a subproof and taking us back one line to the left. We hadn't seen any using those yet, but the next block that I'm going to give you, that's what they all rely on. A couple nice things. You can always open a subproof. And you can even do it inside a subproof. So you can have sub-subproofs. Again, somebody call exhibit. If you want a really easy one to think about, try and think about how you would prove this one. You can also just close subproofs. But of course, it's helpful if you try and get something out of it. But it's worth noting, there's no problem if you make moves in a proof that don't do anything. It's not like it's going to harm you. It's just extra information. And not doing it most efficiently is fine, as long as it still gets done. And the nicest thing about this sort of proof system is the proof lines tell you where you are. Are you on the main proof, the leftmost line? Are you in a subproof? Are you in a sub-subproof? We just keep reiterating that process. Okay. How are we feeling? Does the concept of the subproof stuff make sense? It'll get a little clearer as we keep practicing, right? So here's my proposal. I want to go quickly through conditional introduction, the biconditional introduction and elimination, and then we'll take our break, okay? So, this proof already invokes conditional introduction. And the general idea for conditional introduction is going to be you need to build a subproof, make an additional assumption that starts with your would-be antecedent and ends with your would-be consequent. So, the rule. You have a subproof that starts with your antecedent, ends with your consequent, and from the subproof itself, you derive the conditional. This gives us the third type of citation that we might have. You might cite a single line, you might cite multiple lines, or you might cite, in this case, all the lines in between. So in this case, of course, it's just one then the other, but it might be several lines long. A subproof might be, 7, 8, 15, 40 lines long. And notably, whenever you do conditional introduction, it's always going to be one line to the left of the subproof line that it's citing. So, we've done conjunction, introduction, elimination. It was easy. We've done conditional elimination. It was pretty easy. Conditional introduction, getting a little hairier, right? We got to have the subproof. The biconditional, shockingly, is going to be just like the conditional. Biconditional introduction, cool. You just do conditional introduction twice. One going this way, one going that way. Makes sense. And your citation is both subproofs to literally give you the arrows going both directions. So biconditional introduction works just like the conditional, you just got to do it twice. And biconditional elimination works just like conditional elimination. So that is, for biconditional elimination, what you need is a biconditional and one of the sides. And then you derive the other one. So if you have A biconditional B, and you have A, you can get B. Or the other way around. And just like with conditional elimination, it doesn't matter the order that they appear in. It doesn't matter if one of them is an assumption and one of them is a derived sentence. It's fine. All you need is these. Okay, so pretty good. Conjunction, done. Easy. Introduction, elimination, very straightforward. Conditional, well, the elimination's clear. Introduction, got to do that subproofy stuff. Biconditional, well, it follows the conditional, so if you can do those, you can do biconditional too. All we got left, two more connectives. The disjunction and the negation. Disjunction, introduction, easy. Disjunction, elimination, less easy. Negation, much less easy. So what we're going to do, it's 1:28. We're going to take a 12-minute break. So we'll come back at 40. Right? And we'll talk through the rest of the rules. Cool? All right.